Caleb Rivers stood at the Northline Solutions employee entrance that Tuesday morning, badge in hand, watching dozens of people he technically employed rush past him without a second glance. The September wind off Lake Michigan cut through his cheap jacket, the kind a junior operations assistant could afford. Or at least, the kind he was supposed to afford. For 2 years, Caleb had clocked in at 7:30 every morning, answered phones that never stopped ringing, filed reports that middle management took credit for, and kept his mouth shut when people like Mark Halden treated him like he was invisible. The secret he carried felt heavier some days than others. Today, it felt like carrying a mountain. Because today, Mark had called an 8 a.m. meeting, and the subject line of the email had read Performance Issues, Rivers. Caleb sipped his coffee and walked through the doors, nodding to David Cortez at the security desk. David always smiled at him, always asked about his weekend. If David knew the truth about who Caleb really was, would he still treat him the same? Caleb hoped so. He took the elevator to the 3rd floor, where the operations department hummed with pre-meeting anxiety. The conference room felt like a courtroom. Mark Halden stood at the head of the table with that smirk he wore whenever he was about to destroy someone's day. Caleb recognized that look. He'd seen Mark use it on Jennifer from accounting last month. He'd seen it used on the new kid from IT 2 weeks ago. Now, apparently, it was his turn. "Caleb, thanks for joining us," Mark said, voice dripping with false politeness. Around the table sat 5 other employees, peers who'd worked alongside Caleb but never really knew him. They looked uncomfortable. They should be. "I've been reviewing your performance metrics," Mark continued, sliding a folder across the table. "And frankly, they're unacceptable." Caleb opened the folder calmly. Inside were reports he'd filed, every single one marked up with red ink and dismissive comments. Reports that had actually been praised by clients. Reports that had saved the company thousands in operational errors. But Mark had taken credit for the solutions and left Caleb with the blame for the problems. "These reports are substandard," Mark announced to the room. "Multiple errors, missed deadlines, lack of initiative." Each accusation was a lie. Caleb knew it. Mark knew it. But in this room, Mark had the power. Or so he thought. Caleb didn't interrupt. He'd learned long ago that powerful people often defeated themselves if you gave them enough rope. His father had taught him that. Richard Rivers had built Northline Solutions from a single delivery truck and a dream 23 years ago. He'd survived betrayals, market crashes, and a heart attack that nearly killed him 3 years back. That heart attack had changed everything. Lying in that hospital bed, Richard had made a decision. He'd transferred majority ownership of Northline to Caleb, quietly, legally, irreversibly. But there was a condition. Caleb couldn't reveal who he was. Not until he'd worked every level of the company. Not until he understood what his employees faced daily. Not until he'd earned the right to lead, not through inheritance, but through experience. So Caleb had started at the bottom. Junior operations assistant. Entry-level pay. No special treatment. And he'd watched. Oh, how he'd watched. He'd seen which managers inspired loyalty and which ruled through fear. He'd seen which systems worked and which were broken. He'd seen people like Mark Halden thrive by crushing everyone beneath them. And now he was seeing it directed at him. "Are you even listening to me?" Mark's voice rose, that smirk sliding into genuine anger. Caleb had committed the ultimate sin. He hadn't reacted. "I'm listening," Caleb replied evenly. "You're listing concerns about my work. I disagree with your assessment, but I'm listening." The other employees shifted uncomfortably. Nobody talked back to Mark. Not if they wanted to keep their jobs. Mark's face reddened. "Your attitude is exactly the problem. No accountability. No respect for authority. You think you're smarter than everyone else." Caleb said nothing, because the truth was complicated. He didn't think he was smarter than everyone else. But he did know more about this company than Mark ever would. He knew about the expansion plans Mark wasn't cleared to see. He knew about the client contracts Mark had nearly destroyed with his aggressive tactics. He knew that Mark's department had the highest turnover rate in the entire company. And he knew that this moment, as humiliating as Mark intended it to be, was actually revealing everything Caleb needed to know about the leadership culture that needed to change. But Mark wasn't done. "You're fired." The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. Mark delivered them with satisfaction, like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. You have 15 minutes to clear your desk." Around the table, people looked genuinely shocked. Jennifer Kim, who sometimes ate lunch with Caleb, had her hand over her mouth. Tom from logistics looked like he wanted to say something but didn't dare. Mark crossed his arms, waiting for the reaction. The begging, the anger, the desperate negotiation. Caleb stood slowly. He picked up his leather notebook and pen. He looked Mark directly in the eyes. Not with anger, not with fear, but with something that made Mark's smirk falter for just a second. Certainty. Okay, Caleb said simply. Okay, Mark repeated, thrown off by the lack of drama. That's it? No excuses. No excuses, Caleb confirmed. If you've made your decision, then I respect the process. I'll clear my desk. He walked toward the door. His hand was on the handle when Mark's voice followed him. This is what happens when you don't know your place, Rivers. Remember that. Caleb paused. He almost turned around. He almost said what he was thinking. That Mark had no idea what was about to happen, that this moment would become legendary in Northline history, that firing the owner of the company was probably the worst career decision anyone had ever made. But he didn't. Instead, he walked out. Because some lessons had to be learned the hard way. And Mark Halden's education was just beginning. Caleb walked through the operations department like a man crossing a stage, except this performance had no script and no applause. Just silence. Uncomfortable, heavy silence that made people look at their shoes or suddenly become very interested in their computer screens. Word traveled fast in an office. Everyone already knew. Mark had made sure of that. Caleb could see it in their faces. The mixture of pity, relief that it wasn't them, and that particular kind of social fear that came from watching someone else's downfall. Sarah from Client Services actually turned her back when he passed. Jake from Dispatch pretended to be on a phone call. Only Jennifer Kim met his eyes, and hers were filled with tears she was fighting to hold back. Caleb gave her a small nod. It's okay, the gesture said. I'm okay. But Jennifer didn't look convinced. To everyone watching, Caleb Rivers was just another victim of Mark Halden's reign of terror. Another casualty in the corporate war zone. They had no idea they were watching something else entirely. They were watching the owner of their company walk to his desk for the last time as an undercover employee, and when he came back, and he would come back, everything would be different. David Cortez stood near Caleb's cubicle, and the discomfort rolled off him in waves. Man, I'm sorry about this, David said quietly, glancing around to make sure nobody from management was listening. It's not right. You're one of the good ones. Caleb placed his coffee mug, a generic black one with the Northline logo that every new employee got, into the cardboard box the company had provided. The box itself felt like an insult. Small, flimsy, like they expected people to have nothing worth taking. Thanks, David, Caleb replied, and he meant it. David had been kind to him from day one. Real kindness, not the performative type that management sometimes displayed. David had told him about his daughter's soccer games. They'd talked about the Cubs' chances next season. David had treated him like a person, not a position. Caleb would remember that. I don't know what you did to piss off Halden, David continued, his voice dropping even lower. But between you and me, that guy's a piece of work. Everyone knows it. HR's got a file on him thick as a phone book. Caleb's hand paused over the framed photo of his father. That was interesting. HR had a file. That meant documentation. Evidence. Ammunition. Really? Caleb asked casually, sliding the photo into the box. What kind of stuff? David shrugged. Complaints. Lots of them. Hostile work environment, taking credit for other people's work, harassment. But he's got friends upstairs, you know? Or at least everyone thinks he does. So nothing ever happens. Caleb picked up his leather notebook last, running his thumb over the worn cover. This notebook contained 2 years of observations. Names. Dates. Incidents. He'd documented everything, not because he'd planned for this moment specifically, but because his father had taught him to always gather information. Thanks for telling me, Caleb said, meeting David's eyes. And thanks for being straight with me these past 2 years. I won't forget it. The lobby felt different on the way out. When Caleb had walked in that morning, he'd been just another employee in the crowd. Now, people parted for him like he carried something contagious. Failure. Termination. Bad luck. Whatever they thought it was, they wanted no part of it. David walked beside him, and Caleb appreciated that the security guard didn't rush him or make the walk feel more humiliating than it already was. Some security guards got off on the power. David wasn't one of them. At the reception desk, Michelle, the morning receptionist who always had a bright smile, looked away when they passed. Caleb understood. She had a job to protect, a mortgage to pay, kids in college, if he remembered correctly from the few conversations they'd had. He didn't take it personally. That was the thing about corporate America. Fear made people complicit. Not because they were bad people, but because the system punished solidarity. Mark Halden had fired him without cause, without process, without even basic professional courtesy. And everyone knew it was wrong. But who would stand up and say so? Who would risk their own position to defend a junior operations assistant? Nobody. And that was exactly what Caleb needed to change. They reached the revolving door. Beyond it, Chicago stretched out, the real world, where Northline Solutions was just one company among thousands, and Mark Halden was just one petty tyrant in an expensive suit. "Take care of yourself, Caleb," David said, extending his hand. They shook. Firm. Respectful. "You too, David," Caleb replied. "And don't worry. I have a feeling things are going to change around here pretty soon." David's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't ask. Smart man. Caleb pushed through the revolving door and stepped out into the September morning. The door swished shut behind him, cutting off the artificial air conditioning and replacing it with real Chicago wind. Free air. He stood there for a moment, box in his arms, and allowed himself a small smile. Mark Halden thought he'd won. Mark thought he'd successfully eliminated a problem, asserted his dominance, and sent a message to everyone else about what happened when you didn't show proper deference. But Mark had actually just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. And the clock was already ticking. Caleb's apartment didn't match his supposed financial situation. At all. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. The modern furniture that actually looked comfortable instead of cheap. The kitchen with appliances that cost more than 3 months of a junior operations assistant's salary. Anyone who visited would have questions. That's why nobody from Northline had ever been here. Caleb sat in his leather armchair, real leather Italian, the kind his father had in his office, and stared at his phone. He needed to make the call. He'd been putting it off for 3 hours, not out of fear, but because once he made this call, everything would accelerate. There would be no more quiet. Observation. No more working in the shadows. The truth would come out, and with it, consequences would rain down on Northline Solutions like a storm. His phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer. "I can't believe they fired you. Mark is such an asshole. Are you okay?" Caleb typed back. "I'm fine. Thanks for caring. You're one of the good ones." Another text, this one from a number he didn't recognize. "This is Patricia Hendricks from HR. I heard about your termination. I was not consulted, which is highly irregular. If you want to file a complaint, please contact me." Caleb stared at that message. Patricia Hendricks, head of HR, known for being by the book and not tolerating violations of company policy. He'd observed her from a distance. She ran HR like a fortress, protected employee rights even when it made management uncomfortable, and maintained files on everything. If David was right about Mark having a thick file, Patricia would have been the one maintaining it. Caleb saved her number. He might need her soon. But first, he had to make the other call. He pulled up his father's contact. Richard Rivers. Owner, former owner, of Northline Solutions. Legendary businessman. Difficult father. The man who'd given Caleb this entire company, but made him earn every minute of ownership through 2 years of humiliation and hard lessons. Caleb hit dial. The phone rang once. "Caleb." His father's voice was immediate, concerned. Richard Rivers always knew when something was wrong. "Hey, Dad," Caleb said, keeping his voice steady. "We need to talk." "They did what?" Richard Rivers' voice exploded through the phone so loud that Caleb had to pull it away from his ear. Caleb had expected anger. His father's temper was legendary in business circles. But this was beyond anger. This was volcanic. "Dad, calm down." "Calm down? Some middle management nobody just fired my son, the owner of the company, and you want me to calm down?" Richard's breathing was heavy, and Caleb could hear him pacing. That slight limp from the heart attack made his footsteps uneven. Caleb worried about his father's health in moments like this. "I want you to listen," Caleb said firmly. "Yes, Mark Halden fired me. No, he has no idea who I am. And yes, it was wrong, illegal, and done without any HR involvement." "Give me his full name," Richard demanded. "I'll have lawyers at Northline within the hour. I'll have his employment terminated, his benefits cut, his reputation destroyed." "Dad, stop." Caleb's voice cut through the rage. Silence. Richard Rivers wasn't used to being interrupted. "I don't want you to do that," Caleb continued. Why the hell not? Because this isn't your fight. It's mine. More silence. Caleb could practically hear his father's thoughts. Richard had built Northline with his own hands, survived every challenge, crushed every competitor. The idea that someone would treat his son, his heir, like disposable garbage must have felt like a personal attack. And it was. But that didn't mean Richard got to swoop in and fix it. You gave me this company to teach me how to lead it, Caleb said quietly. Well, I've spent 2 years learning. I've watched how people treat each other when they think nobody important is looking. I've seen which managers inspire and which ones terrorize. I've documented everything. And now I know exactly what needs to change. By getting fired? Richard's voice was still tight with anger. By seeing the system fail exactly the way it fails for every employee who doesn't have power or connections. Dad, Mark didn't fire me because I did bad work. He fired me because he could. Because he's been doing it for years and nobody stops him. If you come in and destroy him, it's just one rich, powerful man crushing someone because he can. That doesn't fix anything. Caleb heard his father sit down heavily. So what do you want to do? Richard asked. I want to handle this the right way. I want to expose the whole system. But I need you to do something first. Name it. Call an emergency board meeting. Tomorrow morning. Tell them it's critical, about ownership transition and company direction. Get every board member, every executive, every investor who matters. Make it mandatory. Caleb heard the smile in his father's voice. You're going to walk in there. I'm going to walk in there, Caleb confirmed. And Mark will be invited as a witness. He'll think he's being praised for decisive leadership or something. He has no idea what's coming. Richard laughed, a real laugh, the kind Caleb hadn't heard in years. You learned more than I thought you would. Okay, it's your play. But Caleb, yeah, after tomorrow, things are going to be different. No more hiding. No more pretending. You ready for that? Caleb looked at his leather notebook, filled with 2 years of observations. At the cardboard box with his pathetic office belongings. At the Chicago skyline outside his window, a city full of companies where people like Mark Halden thrived because nobody checked their power. Yeah, Dad, Caleb said. I'm ready. What happens when an entire company is summoned without knowing why? The Northline Solutions building came alive differently that Wednesday morning. By 6 a.m., every executive's phone had received the same message. Emergency board meeting, 9 a.m. sharp, attendance mandatory, Richard Rivers. Those 2 words at the end, Richard Rivers, made everything stop. Richard hadn't set foot in Northline for 3 years. Not since the heart attack. Not since he'd supposedly retired to let professional management run his creation. His name on an emergency meeting notice was like seeing a ghost announce its return. In homes across Chicago's wealthy suburbs, executives who normally strolled in at 9:30 were showering at 5:45. Lawyers were being called. Assistants were being texted. People were panicking. And Mark Halden, sleeping peacefully in his downtown condo, had no idea that his name was on the attendee list right alongside the board members. He thought yesterday had been a triumph. He thought he'd successfully eliminated a problem employee and reinforced his authority. He was about to discover just how wrong he was. The boardroom on Northline's top floor had been built to impress. 20-foot ceilings. Walls of glass overlooking Lake Michigan. A conference table that cost more than most people earned in a year. This was where fortunes were decided, where strategies were determined, where the future of thousands of employees was shaped by people they'd never meet. By 8:30, the room was filling. Gregory Walsh, the CFO, arrived first, always did. He was a numbers man, methodical, hated surprises. This meeting was definitely a surprise. Any idea what this is about? He asked Patricia Hendricks, the HR director, who'd arrived seconds after him. Patricia shook her head. She'd been with Northline for 15 years, survived 3 major restructurings, and prided herself on knowing everything that happened in the company. This meeting was news to her. That worried her. Richard hasn't attended a board meeting in 3 years, Patricia said quietly. Pouring coffee, she didn't want just to have something to do with her hands. If he's calling us in, something significant has changed. More executives filtered in. Martha Chen, VP of Operations. James Bradford, Chief Legal Counsel. Teresa Gomez, Head of Client Relations. Each one looked confused, concerned, and slightly terrified. Nobody had answers. Outside investors started arriving. Serious people in serious suits who owned serious percentages of Northline stock. They didn't fly in from New York and San Francisco for routine meetings. Whatever Richard Rivers wanted, it was big enough to summon them immediately. At 8:55, Mark Halden walked in. He looked pleased with himself, assuming he'd been called to some kind of recognition. Maybe Richard had heard about his decisive action yesterday. Maybe this was about promoting him to senior management. Mark took a seat near the middle of the table, nodded to a few executives, and helped himself to coffee. He had no idea that every person in that room would soon be staring at him for very different reasons than he expected. At 8:58, a Blacktown car pulled up to Northline's main entrance. David Cortez, working the morning security shift, watched it arrive with more attention than usual. He'd been told to expect important arrivals. But when the car door opened and Richard Rivers stepped out, tall, commanding, gray hair gleaming in the morning sun, three-piece suit that probably cost what David made in 3 months, David straightened instinctively. Richard Rivers was a legend. The founder. The man who'd built Northline from nothing. David had worked at Northline for 8 years and had only seen Richard twice, both times from a distance. "Good morning, sir," David said, holding the door. Richard paused. He looked at David's name tag. David Cortez. "You were kind to my son yesterday." David's eyes widened. "Your son?" I don't understand, sir." "You will," Richard said with a slight smile. "Keep being one of the good ones, David. We're going to need more people like you." Richard walked past, leaving David completely confused. His son? Richard Rivers had a son who worked here? Before David could process that, another car pulled up. This one had been waiting down the block, deliberately arriving after Richard. The door opened and Caleb Rivers stepped out. Same Caleb who'd been fired yesterday. Same Caleb who David had escorted out with a cardboard box. Except this Caleb looked different. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit perfectly. His hair was styled with more care. He carried his leather notebook and a slim briefcase. And his eyes, those calm brown eyes that had shown no fear yesterday, now showed something else entirely. Purpose. "Morning, David," Caleb said calmly. "Big day." "Mr. Rivers," David stammered, suddenly putting pieces together that didn't make sense. "I didn't know, you're Richard's son," Caleb finished. "And as of 3 years ago, majority owner of Northline Solutions. But that's not public knowledge yet." "Well, it wasn't. It's about to be." David felt like the ground had shifted under his feet. The junior operations assistant he'd escorted out yesterday was actually the owner of the entire company? "Does Mark Halden know?" David asked. Caleb's smile was subtle but unmistakable. "He's about to." The boardroom was full. Every seat taken. People who normally commanded rooms themselves now sat in uncertain silence, waiting for an explanation that hadn't come. Mark Halden scrolled through his phone, occasionally smirking at something. Yesterday's firing was still fresh in his mind. He'd told the story to his girlfriend last night over expensive wine, framing himself as the decisive leader who didn't tolerate mediocrity. She'd been impressed. He felt validated. The door at the far end of the boardroom opened. Everyone looked up. Richard Rivers entered first. The room shifted. People sat straighter, put down coffee cups, gave him full attention. This was the man who'd built everything they benefited from. But Richard wasn't alone. Behind him walked Caleb. And the room's confusion became almost physical. "Is that?" Martha Chun whispered to James Bradford. "That's the kid from operations," James whispered back. "The one Halden fired yesterday." Mark Halden's smirk vanished. His phone slipped slightly in his hand. Why was Rivers, the junior assistant he'd fired, walking in with Richard Rivers? Why was he wearing a suit that expensive? Why did he look so calm? Richard moved to the head of the table. Caleb took the seat directly to his right, the seat traditionally reserved for the CEO or heir apparent. Several executives exchanged confused glances. Patricia Hendricks watched Caleb with dawning realization in her eyes. Gregory Walsh slowly removed his reading glasses, his analytical mind clearly working through possibilities he hadn't considered. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Richard began, his voice carrying that natural authority that made people listen. "I know this is unusual. I know you have questions. But this meeting is necessary because yesterday, something happened that requires immediate attention." Richard continued, his gray eyes scanning the room. "Yesterday, one of our managers, Mark Halden, who's sitting right there, terminated an employee named Caleb Rivers. The termination was done without HR consultation, without proper documentation, without cause, and in front of other employees as a display of authority." Patricia Hendricks' face hardened. That was against every protocol she'd established. James Bradford, the legal counsel, looked like he'd just swallowed glass. That was a lawsuit waiting to happen. Mark's face had gone pale. His eyes darted between Richard and Caleb, his brain clearly trying to understand what was happening. Now, normally, Richard continued, an improper termination would be handled through HR, possibly result in corrective action or termination of the manager, and the company would move on. But this situation is different. Richard placed his hand on Caleb's shoulder. Because the employee Mark Halden fired without cause, without process, and without even basic human decency, is my son. And as of 3 years ago, following my health scare, Caleb Rivers is the majority shareholder and legal owner of Northline Solutions. The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Mark Halden's expensive coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the mahogany table, hot liquid spreading across legal documents and leather portfolios. But nobody noticed, because every single person in that room was staring at Caleb, then at Mark, then back at Caleb, processing the impossible reality that had just been revealed. Mark Halden hadn't just fired an employee. He'd fired his boss. He'd fired the owner of the company. And he'd done it with an audience. Have you ever watched someone's entire world collapse in real time? The silence lasted exactly 7 seconds. Caleb counted. 7 seconds of absolute, crushing silence where 18 of Chicago's most powerful business professionals tried to process information that didn't fit their understanding of reality. Then everyone started talking at once. Wait, what? Since when? That's impossible. The kid from operations is 3 years. Richard raised his hand, and the chaos stopped. That was power. Real power. Not the kind Mark Halden wielded through fear, but the kind earned through decades of respect and results. Let me clarify, Richard said calmly. 3 years ago, I had a heart attack. Some of you remember. I survived, obviously, but it made me reconsider succession planning. I didn't want Northline going to someone who'd just inherited it. I wanted it led by someone who understood it from the ground up. He gestured to Caleb. So I legally transferred majority ownership to my son, with one condition. He had to work here for at least 2 years at entry level, with no special treatment, no revelation of his identity, and no interference from me. He had to earn the right to lead by experiencing what our employees experience. Gregory Walsh found his voice first. 2 years. He's been here for 2 years. 26 months, Caleb spoke for the first time, his voice steady. Started as a junior operations assistant in October 2 years ago. Worked under 4 different managers. Documented everything. Martha Chin leaned forward. You've been observing us? Learning from you, Caleb corrected. The good and the bad. Understanding what works and what needs to change. Caleb stood slowly. He'd practiced this moment in his mind 100 times, but the reality felt different. Heavier. More real. Every eye in the room tracked him as he moved toward the head of the table, standing beside his father. I know you all have questions, Caleb began, and we'll address them. But first, let's talk about yesterday. He opened his leather notebook. Mark Halden called me into a meeting at 8 a.m. No advance warning. No agenda. No HR representative present, which violates company policy outlined in Section 4.2 of the Employee Handbook. Patricia Hendricks nodded grimly, pulling out her tablet and starting to take notes. He presented me with a folder of my work, marked up with criticisms that directly contradicted client feedback and internal metrics. He accused me of poor performance, missed deadlines, and bad attitude, none of which were documented in any official review. James Bradford, the legal counsel, was also taking notes now, his expression growing darker. Then he fired me, in front of 5 other employees. Without cause. Without process. Without even checking with HR or legal. He gave me 15 minutes to clear my desk and had security escort me out. Caleb's eyes found Mark, who'd shrunk into his chair like he wished he could disappear. Now, Mark probably thought he was being a strong leader. Decisive. Taking charge. But what he actually did was violate multiple company policies, create liability for wrongful termination, and demonstrate exactly the kind of toxic management culture that drives good employees away. Teresa Gomez, head of client relations, raised her hand tentatively. If I may ask, why didn't you just tell him who you were? Why let it happen? Caleb smiled slightly. Because if I'd revealed myself, Mark would have apologized, backtracked, maybe even begged for his job. And then nothing would have changed. He'd still be the same manager, just more careful about who he targeted. The system would still be broken. He turned back to the room. But by letting it play out naturally, we all got to see exactly what happens when managers have unchecked power and employees have no protection. And more importantly, we got to see it documented, witnessed, and undeniable. Patricia Hendricks stood. When she stood, people paid attention. 15 years as head of HR at a company that had grown from 50 employees to over 3,000 had taught her exactly when to speak and when to listen. Now is time to speak. With your permission, Caleb, she said, using his name deliberately, acknowledging his authority. I'd like to address the Mark Halden situation directly. Caleb nodded. Please. Patricia pulled a thick folder from her briefcase. It landed on the mahogany table with a heavy thud. This, she said, is Mark Halden's personnel file. It contains 43 separate complaints filed over the past 4 years. Hostile work environment. Taking credit for others' work. Verbal harassment. Creating fear-based management culture. Retaliation against employees who questioned his decisions. The room was silent again, but different this time. This was the silence of people realizing they'd been complicit through inaction. 43 complaints, Patricia repeated, her voice hard. And yet Mark Halden continued to be promoted, continued to receive bonuses, continued to have complete authority over hiring and firing in his department. You want to know why? She looked around the room at executives who suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. Because every time I brought these issues to senior management, I was told that Mark gets results. That his numbers were good. That employees today are too sensitive. That we couldn't afford to lose aggressive managers in a competitive market. Mark had gone from pale to gray. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair. So these complaints were documented, filed, and ignored, Patricia continued. Which means Northline Solutions, which means all of us in leadership, created an environment where managers like Mark could abuse power without consequences. Until yesterday, when he finally crossed a line he didn't even know existed. Mark Halden tried to speak. His voice came out rough, uncertain. I didn't know. How could I have known who he was? This isn't fair. Fair? Caleb's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through Mark's protest like a blade. You're right. You didn't know who I was. But let me ask you something, Mark. Would it have been okay to fire me the way you did if I was just a regular employee? Silence. Would it have been okay to humiliate me in front of my peers if I didn't have powerful connections? More silence. Would it have been okay to ignore HR protocols and due process if I was just some 26-year-old kid trying to pay rent and build a career? Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. That's the problem, Caleb said quietly. Your actions weren't wrong because you did them to the owner. They were wrong because you did them to another human being. The fact that I happen to own the company just means you're finally facing consequences that 43 other people never got to see. Gregory Walsh cleared his throat. Caleb, what are you proposing we do here? Caleb looked at his father, who nodded. This was his decision. His company now. First, Caleb said, Mark Halden's employment is terminated immediately. For cause. Which means no severance package beyond what's legally required, no positive reference, and a permanent note in his employment record about the circumstances of his termination. Mark started to protest, but James Bradford, the legal counsel, shook his head sharply. Don't make it worse. Second, Caleb continued, we're going to review every single complaint in Mark's file and reach out to those employees. Some may have left the company because of his behavior. We're going to apologize. And where appropriate, we're going to make it right. Patricia was nodding, already making notes. Third, we're implementing a new management accountability system. Anonymous reporting with mandatory investigation. Regular 360-degree reviews where subordinates can evaluate their managers. And most importantly, a zero-tolerance policy for retaliation. Caleb closed his notebook. This company was built by my father through hard work and integrity. Somewhere along the way, we lost that. We started valuing numbers over people. Results over respect. That changes today. The room had shifted. 10 minutes ago, these executives had walked in confused and defensive. Now they looked engaged. Energized even. Martha Chin spoke up. Caleb, I've been VP of Operations for 6 years. I'm ashamed to say I knew Mark was a problem and didn't push hard enough for change. What you're proposing, this accountability system, I want to be part of building it. Me too, added Teresa Gomez. Client relations has lost good people because of toxic management. If we're really going to change the culture, I want to help. One by one, executives voiced support. Not because Caleb was the owner, though that certainly helped, but because he was speaking to something they'd all felt and ignored. The knowledge that the company culture had deteriorated. That good people were leaving. That numbers were being achieved at the cost of humanity. Gregory Walsh looked at Richard. You planned this from the beginning, didn't you? The whole undercover owner thing. Richard smiled. I planned for Caleb to learn the business from the ground up. The Mark Halden situation was just opportunity meeting preparation. But why reveal it now? Gregory asked. You could have let Caleb work another year, learn even more. Because, Richard said, looking at his son with unmistakable pride, leadership isn't about gathering information forever. It's about knowing when to act. Caleb could have told me what happened and let me storm in and fix everything. Instead, he called a board meeting, prepared his case, and took ownership of the solution. That's when I knew he was ready. Caleb felt the weight of his father's words. 2 years of keeping secrets, of being treated as invisible, of watching and learning. It had all been building to this moment. Mark Halden was still in his chair, legally required to stay until formally terminated, forced to watch his career implode. But Caleb felt no satisfaction in that. Only a determination that what happened to him, what Mark had done to him and countless others, would never happen again at Northline Solutions. Patricia approached Caleb with her tablet. I'll need you to sign the official termination documents. And then we should discuss the transition plan for Mark's department. They'll need new leadership immediately. Caleb nodded. I have some ideas about that. But first, let's make sure everyone in that department knows that what happened to me yesterday isn't acceptable, and it won't be tolerated going forward. The meeting continued for another hour. Plans were made. Policies were drafted. A company was being rebuilt from the inside. And when it finally ended, when executives filed out with new purpose and new marching orders, Caleb stood at the window overlooking Chicago. His city. His company. His responsibility now. Richard joined him. You did well. Did I? Mark's life is destroyed. His career is over. Mark's life is experiencing consequences for his actions, Richard corrected. That's different. You gave him what he gave others, accountability. The difference is you did it fairly, with due process, with documentation. He did it with cruelty. Caleb nodded slowly. What happens next is the hard part. Building always is, Richard agreed. Tearing down is easy. Creating something better takes real work. They stood together in silence, father and son, looking out over the city where Northline Solutions would either become an example of corporate transformation or just another company that talked about change but never delivered it. Caleb knew which one he intended to build. What does the end of a career look like? Mark Halden sat alone at the boardroom table where an hour ago he'd felt confident, even smug. Now legal termination documents sat in front of him, waiting for his signature. Patricia Hendricks stood nearby, professional but not unkind. This was her least favorite part of the job, but also the most necessary. You need to sign these, she said quietly. They outline your termination for cause, final paycheck calculation, return of company property, and non-disclosure agreement. Mark's hand shook as he picked up the pen. This is insane. I was doing my job. How was I supposed to know? That's exactly the problem, Mark, Patricia interrupted. You keep saying you didn't know who Caleb was. But you should have treated him right regardless of who he was. That's the point you're still missing. Mark signed. His signature looked nothing like the bold, confident scrawl he usually used. This one was small, defeated. David Cortez stepped forward. I'll need your badge, your building access card, your company laptop, and your phone. The same process Caleb had gone through yesterday. The same humiliation. The same walk past employees who would watch and whisper. I need to get my personal items from my office, Mark said. I can't just leave everything. Your office has been inventoried, Patricia said. Personal items will be boxed and delivered to your home address within 48 hours. That's standard procedure for termination with cause. Mark looked up at her, and for the first time, there might have been actual understanding in his eyes. This is what I did to all those people, isn't it? This exact process. This exact humiliation. Yes, Patricia said simply. Except they didn't deserve it. The email hit company inboxes at 10:15 a.m. From Caleb Rivers, majority owner and chairman subject. Leadership changes and company direction. The operations floor exploded with noise. People abandoned their cubicles, gathered in clusters, pulled out their phones to make sure they'd read it correctly. Caleb owns the company? The kid from operations? He's been here for 2 years. Mark Halden got fired. Oh my God, Mark fired the owner. Jennifer Kim stood in the middle of the chaos, reading and rereading the email, her hands shaking. She'd eaten lunch with Caleb dozens of times. They'd complained about Mark together. She'd recommended good pizza places. And he'd been the owner the entire time? Her phone buzzed. A text from Caleb. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. But thank you for being kind to someone you thought was nobody. That meant more than you know. Jennifer felt tears building. She'd been kind because that's who she was, not because she thought Caleb was important. But apparently, that's exactly why it mattered. Around her, reactions varied wildly. Some people were excited, especially those who'd been on the receiving end of Mark's cruelty. Finally, someone in power who'd seen what they went through. Others were nervous. If the owner had been watching for 2 years, what else had he seen? What other managers might be in trouble? And a few, the ones who'd treated Caleb badly, who'd ignored him or dismissed him or been casually cruel, looked terrified. Sarah from Client Services, who'd turned her back when Caleb was being escorted out yesterday, had gone pale. Jake from Dispatch, who'd pretended to be on a phone call, was staring at his computer screen like it might offer salvation. They were realizing that kindness and cruelty left records. And someone had been keeping score. By lunchtime, Caleb's old cubicle had become something like a shrine. Not because anyone organized it, but because people needed to process what had happened. Someone from accounting had left a note. Thank you for seeing us. The facilities team had placed flowers on his chair. And people kept walking by, taking photos, sharing stories. He helped me figure out that shipping error last month. One guy from logistics told a cluster of listeners. Spent 2 hours running reports that weren't even his job. I tried to buy him coffee to say thanks, but he said it was nothing. He stayed late 3 times to cover my shifts when my mom was in the hospital, a woman from customer service added. Never asked for anything in return. Never even mentioned it to management. Story after story. Small kindnesses. Moments of competence. Times when Caleb had helped someone without seeking credit or recognition. Nobody had noticed because he was supposedly nobody. But now, recontextualized through the lens of ownership, every interaction was being reevaluated. Had he been testing them? Evaluating them? Judging them? Jennifer finally spoke up. He wasn't testing us. He was just being himself. That's what you're all missing. He didn't help people because he was secretly the owner. He helped people because that's who he is. And now he's in charge. The crowd went quiet. Which means, Jennifer continued, that maybe the company is going to be run by someone who actually gives a damn about the people doing the work. Doesn't that sound like a good thing? Slowly, people started nodding. The fear was being replaced by something else. Hope, maybe. Or at least curiosity about what came next. Caleb and his father had lunch at Richard's favorite restaurant. The kind of place where politicians made deals and CEOs planned mergers. They sat in a corner booth that offered privacy without isolation. The board is on your side, Richard said, cutting into a steak he wouldn't finish. But they'll be watching. They need to see that you can lead, not just expose bad management. I know, Caleb replied. He'd barely touched his pasta. His stomach was still processing the morning. Gregory already sent me a list of concerns, mostly around the financial impact of the changes I proposed. And I have answers. The accountability system will reduce turnover, which saves money on recruiting and training. Better management culture improves productivity. Happy employees stay longer and work harder. It's not complicated math. Richard smiled. You sound like me 20 years ago. Is that good or bad? Good mostly. Just remember that numbers aren't everything. I learned that the hard way. Richard's expression grew serious. You know why I really transferred ownership to you 3 years ago? The heart attack. That was the catalyst. But the real reason was that I'd built a company I was proud of, and then I looked around one day and realized I didn't recognize it anymore. Somewhere between 50 employees and 3,000, we'd lost something essential. I didn't know how to fix it from the top down. But I thought maybe someone starting at the bottom might figure it out. Caleb absorbed that. So this was never just about teaching me the business. No, it was about saving the company's soul. If it still had one. They sat in silence for a moment. The weight of that responsibility settled over Caleb like a physical thing. What if I can't fix it? Caleb asked quietly. What if it's too broken? Then at least you'll know you tried, Richard said. But I don't think it's too broken. I think it just needs someone who remembers that companies aren't just numbers and strategy. They're people. Thousands of people whose lives are affected by the decisions we make. Richard pushed his plate aside and leaned forward. Mark Halden was a symptom, not the disease. The disease is a culture that values results over humanity. You've diagnosed it. Now you have to cure it. And Caleb? That's going to be much harder than exposing one bad manager. Caleb returned to Northline at 3 p.m. He'd been gone for 5 hours, but it felt like 5 years. The building felt different now. Or maybe he felt different in it. When he walked onto the operations floor, his floor, where he'd worked for 26 months, conversations stopped. People turned. Some looked excited. Some looked nervous. All of them looked curious. Jennifer Kim approached first. "So," she said, stopping a few feet away, "do I need to call you Mr. Rivers now? Or Chairman? Or, Caleb's fine," he said with a small smile. "I haven't changed. Just the context." "That's not entirely true," Jennifer replied. "The context is pretty huge." "Fair point." Other employees gradually approached. A few wanted to shake his hand. Some apologized for not being friendlier when he was just an assistant. Caleb stopped that immediately. "Don't apologize for treating me like a regular coworker. That's exactly what I wanted. The people who should apologize are the ones who treated me, or anyone, badly." He made a point to walk through the department, stopping at cubicles, asking people how they were doing. Not as the owner, but as someone who'd sat in these same cubicles, answered these same phones, dealt with these same frustrations. David Cortez caught his eye from near the elevators. The security guard gave him a subtle thumbs up. Caleb returned it. As he walked, he overheard fragments of conversation. "Actually cares about us, wonder what other changes are coming, hope they fire Thompson next. He's almost as bad as Mark." That last one caught his attention. Thompson, regional manager in logistics. Caleb had notes about him too. This wasn't over. Mark Halden had been the most obvious problem, but he wasn't the only one. There were other managers who'd built little kingdoms of fear. Other systems that protected bad behavior. Other policies that needed changing. The work was just beginning. But as Caleb looked around the operations floor, at people who finally felt like maybe someone in power understood their experience, he felt something he hadn't felt in 26 months. Not relief, exactly. Not triumph. More like alignment. The secret had been crushing him, he realized. Playing a role. Pretending to be powerless. Now he could finally be himself and do the work he'd been preparing for. Jennifer appeared beside him again. "There's a rumor going around that you documented everything for 2 years. Every manager interaction, every policy violation, every moment of good and bad leadership." "That's not a rumor," Caleb confirmed. "That's accurate. Are people in trouble? I mean, besides Mark?" Caleb looked at her directly. "People who are doing their jobs well and treating others with respect have nothing to worry about. People who were abusing power and creating toxic environments should probably be concerned. Does that answer your question?" Jennifer smiled. "Yeah, that answers it perfectly." By the time Caleb left the building at 6 p.m., the story had spread beyond Northline. Social media posts. Industry gossip. News that a 26-year-old had been working undercover at his own company and exposed corrupt management. It was the kind of story that made headlines. Chicago CEO works undercover, fires manager who fired him. Tomorrow would bring media attention, requests for interviews, industry analysis. But tonight, Caleb just went home to his apartment overlooking Chicago and opened his leather notebook one more time. He flipped to a blank page and wrote, "Day 1 of actually leading. Here's what I learned. Exposing problems is easy. Building solutions is hard. But we're going to do it anyway." Then he closed the notebook and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Mark Halden was probably drinking, cursing, maybe crying. Somewhere out there, employees who'd felt powerless for years were feeling something different. And somewhere out there, his father was probably smiling, knowing that he'd made the right decision 3 years ago when he'd put his company in his son's hands. The work was just beginning. But for the first time in 26 months, Caleb Rivers felt ready. Can an entire company culture shift in just 1 week? Caleb was about to find out. 7 days after the board meeting that changed everything, Northline Solutions looked different. Not physically, the same glass building, same revolving doors, same David Cortez greeting people at security. But there was an energy that hadn't existed before. Anticipation mixed with anxiety. People arrived earlier, lingered in conversations longer, watched management with new scrutiny. Because everyone knew that when Caleb said things would change, he meant it. And changes were coming fast. The news media had latched onto the story. Undercover CEO exposes corporate corruption. Ran on 3 major news sites. A business podcast wanted an interview. LinkedIn was exploding with think pieces about authentic leadership. But Caleb had declined all interview requests. He wasn't interested in being a media darling. He was interested in fixing his company. The banner hanging outside, New Management Training Program, was just the beginning. Inside, Caleb had converted the executive conference room into a temporary war room. Whiteboards covered every wall, filled with organizational charts, policy proposals, and employee feedback data. Patricia Hendricks, Gregory Walsh, and Martha Chen had become his core transformation team. Together, they'd spent the week analyzing every department, every manager, every system that needed attention. Thompson from Logistics, Patricia said, tapping her tablet. 17 complaints in 3 years. Mostly around retaliation and creating hostile work environment for anyone who questioned his decisions. Caleb looked at the organizational chart. Thompson's department had 43 employees and the second highest turnover rate in the company. Right behind Mark Halden's former department. What kept him employed? Caleb asked. Gregory answered. Numbers. His department consistently hits delivery targets and keeps costs low. From a pure metrics perspective, he's effective. And from a human perspective, he's destroying people, Martha said bluntly. I've had 3 exit interviews this year from his department. All 3 specifically cited Thompson as their reason for leaving. Good employees. People we didn't want to lose. Caleb made a note. So we're losing talent to keep a manager who hits numbers through fear and intimidation. That's not sustainable. It's also not as profitable as it looks, Gregory added, pointing to a financial projection he'd prepared. When you factor in recruitment costs, training costs, lost productivity during transitions, and the experience lost when good people leave, Thompson's efficiency actually costs us roughly $300,000 per year more than a stable, well-managed department would. Patricia looked surprised. You can quantify that? I can quantify everything, Gregory said with a slight smile. That's my job. And what the numbers show is that toxic management is expensive. We just don't usually measure those costs because they're indirect. Caleb felt a surge of gratitude for Gregory's analytical mind. This was exactly what he needed. Hard data to back up what his gut already knew. Thompson gets the same deal as Mark, Caleb decided. Performance review meeting with HR present, documentation of complaints, termination for cause. We're not tolerating this anymore. Martha added Thompson's name to a list on the whiteboard. There were 4 other names already there. For other managers whose patterns of behavior had created toxic environments. This wasn't going to be a single dramatic firing. This was going to be a systematic cleaning of the entire management structure. We need to be careful, Patricia warned. 5 management terminations in 2 weeks is going to cause panic. People will worry that they're next. Good, Caleb said, then softened his tone. I mean, people who've been abusing power should be worried. People who've been doing their jobs with integrity have nothing to fear. But we need to communicate that clearly. The company-wide town hall was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. Every employee, from executives to entry-level, was invited. Required, actually. Caleb stood backstage, reviewing his notes one last time. He could hear the auditorium filling. 1,200 people. 1,200 employees whose lives would be affected by the decisions he made. No pressure. Jennifer Kim appeared beside him. You ready? She'd become his unofficial sounding board over the past week. Someone who understood the employee perspective because she'd lived it. I don't think you're ever ready for something like this, Caleb admitted. But I'm going to do it anyway. Good answer. She squeezed his arm encouragingly. Just remember, they're on your side. Most of them, anyway. They want to believe things can be better. Caleb walked onto the stage. The auditorium went quiet instantly. He looked out at the sea of faces. Some he recognized from his time in operations. Others he'd only observed from a distance. All of them were watching him with that same mixture of hope and skepticism that defined organizational change. Thank you for coming, Caleb began, his voice steady despite the nerves. I know the past week has been chaotic. I know there are rumors flying around about mass firings, complete restructuring, and every other dramatic possibility. So I want to be direct about what's actually happening. The screen behind him lit up with a simple slide. 3 core principles. First principle, we value people over metrics. That doesn't mean metrics don't matter. They absolutely do. But we're not going to hit our numbers by destroying the humans who generate them. If a manager can only succeed by creating fear and misery, they're not actually succeeding. Scattered applause. Some people looked relieved. Others looked vindicated. Second principle. Accountability applies to everyone, including me. We're implementing a management evaluation system where your feedback on your managers actually matters and actually has consequences. And yes, that includes feedback on me. I'm not exempt from accountability just because I own the company. More applause, stronger this time. People were sitting forward, engaged. Third principle. We're going to fix systems, not just fire people. Mark Halden was a symptom of broken systems that allowed toxic management to thrive. We're fixing those systems. New HR policies. Transparent promotion criteria. Anonymous reporting with mandatory investigation. Protection against retaliation. The slide changed to show the new policies in detail. Caleb walked through each one, explaining not just what was changing but why. He talked about the exit interviews that showed people leaving because of bad management, the recruitment costs, the lost productivity, the human toll. And he did something most executives never did. He admitted mistakes. Our leadership, including my father, including the board, including me, failed you by allowing toxic management to continue. We knew there were problems, and we didn't act decisively enough. That ends now. And I'm starting with the hardest changes first. The next slide appeared. Management changes. A murmur went through the crowd. Over the next 2 weeks, Caleb continued, 5 managers will be terminated for documented patterns of toxic behavior, policy violations, and creating hostile work environments. These aren't reactive firings. They're based on years of complaints, exit interviews, and evidence that we should have acted on long ago. He paused, letting that sink in. I know some of you are thinking, is my manager one of them? Should I be worried? Here's how you can tell. If your manager treats you with respect, follows HR policies, gives credit where it's due, and creates an environment where you can do your best work, they're not on the list. If your manager rules through fear, takes credit for your work, retaliates against people who speak up, and makes you dread coming to work, yeah, they might be on the list. Nervous laughter rippled through the auditorium, but also nods of recognition. People knew exactly which managers he was talking about. But here's what's important, Caleb said, his voice growing stronger. We're not just firing bad managers and calling it fixed. Every departing manager's team will receive immediate support. New leadership will be promoted from within when possible, people who've demonstrated both competence and character. We're also implementing a 6-month management training program for all current and future managers, focusing on actual leadership skills, not just hitting targets. The slide changed again. Your voice matters. Starting next week, every employee will receive a confidential survey about their management experience. Not just softball questions. Real questions. Do you feel psychologically safe raising concerns? Does your manager take credit for your work? Have you witnessed or experienced retaliation? Your answers will be anonymous. The data will be reviewed by HR and by me personally, and it will have real consequences. Caleb took a breath. I spent 26 months working alongside many of you. I saw what you deal with. I know which systems are broken and which managers abuse power. But I don't know everything. You do. You're the experts on what it's really like to work here. So I'm asking you to tell me, honestly, without fear, help me fix this company. The town hall ended with extended applause. But the real test came afterward, when Caleb didn't retreat to an executive office. He stood in the hallway outside the auditorium and talked to anyone who approached. A woman from accounting. My manager isn't toxic, but she's overwhelmed. She manages 15 people and barely has time to check in with any of us. Is there help coming for managers who are trying but drowning? Caleb made a note. That's exactly the kind of feedback I need. We'll look at manager-to-employee ratios across departments. Thank you. A guy from IT. I appreciate what you're doing, but I've seen companies announce changes before and nothing actually happens. How do we know this is different? Fair question. You hold me accountable, Caleb said. That survey I mentioned? There's a question on it. Do you believe leadership is following through on promised changes? If that number isn't improving month over month, then I'm failing. And I'll know it because you'll tell me. A logistics worker. Thompson is one of the 5, isn't he? Caleb met the man's eyes. I can't confirm specific names before official termination meetings happen. But I can tell you that any manager with 17 documented complaints isn't going to be managing people here anymore. The worker's shoulders relaxed visibly. Thank you. He made 3 people cry last month alone. It's been hell. More conversations. More feedback. More stories that would become data points in the transformation. Jennifer appeared beside him after an hour. You're exhausted. You need to eat something and get some rest. There's too much to do, Caleb, she interrupted gently. You can't fix everything in 1 week. Pace yourself. This is a marathon, not a sprint. She was right. He could feel it. The adrenaline that had been sustaining him was starting to fade. Okay, he conceded. But first thing tomorrow, I want to start the Thompson meeting. Get it over with. Already scheduled, Patricia said, joining them. 9 a.m. Conference room. His entire file is prepared. Caleb nodded. And the other 4? Staggered across next week. We're doing this by the book. Every termination will be documented, witnessed, and legally clean. That was Patricia. Thorough. Professional. Unshakable. As Caleb finally headed home that evening, his phone buzzed with messages. News outlets still wanted interviews. Business schools wanted him to speak about his experience. A documentary crew wanted to film the transformation. He ignored them all. This wasn't about his personal story. This was about fixing a broken system. And the hardest part was still ahead. Thompson sat across from Caleb with the kind of arrogance that comes from years of unchecked power. He'd been with Northline for 12 years, managing logistics for the last 7. His department ran efficiently, if you measured efficiency purely by numbers and ignored the human cost. I don't understand why I'm here, Thompson said, his voice carrying irritation more than concern. My department has the second best performance metrics in the company. If this is about some complaint from an employee who couldn't handle the pressure. It's about 17 complaints, Caleb interrupted calmly, sliding the file across the table. From 15 different employees over 3 years. Would you like to review them? Thompson's face darkened. Complaints from people who couldn't cut it. Every one of them was underperforming. Actually, Patricia said, consulting her tablet, 12 of the 15 were rated meets expectations or higher on their formal reviews. 3 went on to successful careers at competitor companies. And your department has 68% turnover compared to the company average of 32%. The numbers hit like punches. Thompson's jaw clenched. I run a tight ship. Some people can't handle that. But my numbers speak for themselves. Caleb opened the file. Let's talk about your numbers. Your department hits delivery targets, yes. But let's look at the full picture. He pulled out a spreadsheet Gregory had prepared. Your department's recruitment costs are 43% higher than comparable departments because you burn through employees. Training costs are elevated for the same reason. And you've had 4 workplace injury reports this year, all related to employees rushing to meet your unofficial deadlines that exceed safety protocols. Thompson shifted in his seat. Those injuries were employee error. Those injuries were the result of you pressuring people to skip safety procedures to hit arbitrary targets, Caleb corrected. We have documentation. We have witness statements. We have your own emails telling employees that safety protocols are suggestions for people who can't work fast enough. Patricia pulled up the complaint log on her tablet and turned it so Thompson could see. March 2023. You publicly berated an employee for taking a sick day, calling them weak and suggesting they were lying. Witnesses 4. June 2023. You took credit for a process improvement that was created by your team, presenting it to senior management as your own idea. Documentation. Email chain showing the original proposal came from Sarah Chin. September 2023. You denied a schedule accommodation request for an employee whose child had a medical emergency, telling them family problems aren't my concern. Witness, the employee plus 2 others who heard the conversation. She scrolled further. Should I continue? Because I have 14 more months of documented incidents. Thompson's arrogance was cracking. Management requires tough decisions. I can't coddle everyone who has a sob story. There's a difference between tough management and abusive management, Caleb said. Tough management sets high standards and supports people in reaching them. Abusive management tears people down, creates fear, and treats humans as disposable resources. You've been doing the latter for years, and we've been failing our employees by allowing it to continue. So what, you're firing me? Thompson's voice rose. After 12 years? After everything I've contributed? Because some people couldn't handle real work. No, Caleb said calmly. We're terminating your employment for cause based on documented policy violations, creation of hostile work environment, and behavior inconsistent with Northline's values. The length of your tenure doesn't excuse years of misconduct. James Bradford, the company lawyer, slid the termination documents forward. Your employment ends today. You'll receive your final paycheck according to legal requirements, but no severance package due to termination for cause. You have 1 hour to clear your personal belongings under HR supervision. Your company access is being revoked as we speak. Thompson's walk through the logistics department was silent. The same silence that had followed Caleb a week ago. But this silence felt different. Where people had pitted Caleb, they watched Thompson with something else entirely. Vindication. Relief. The satisfaction of seeing accountability finally arrive. Sarah Chun, the employee whose process improvement Thompson had stolen credit for, stood at her cubicle and made direct eye contact as he passed. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, just looked at him with an expression that said, "You're finally getting what you deserve." A younger logistics coordinator actually had tears in her eyes, but they weren't sad tears. They were the tears of someone who'd been carrying a weight for so long that they'd forgotten what it felt like without it. Near the exit, Thompson turned back toward his former department. Caleb had a feeling he was about to say something dramatic, maybe threaten lawsuits or curse everyone out. But David Cortez, who'd handled this exact escort hundreds of times, gently touched Thompson's elbow. "Sir, please keep moving. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Thompson's mouth closed. He walked out, and when the door shut behind him, something happened that never happened when Caleb was escorted out. The logistics department erupted in conversation. Not whispers. Actual voices. "Oh my God, it actually happened. I can't believe they finally. He's really gone? Maybe we can actually breathe now." Caleb had watched from a distance, not wanting to make his presence a spectacle. But now he walked onto the floor. Conversation stopped. People looked at him with something between gratitude and uncertainty. "I know this morning has been intense," Caleb said, addressing the gathered employees. "And I know change is uncomfortable even when it's necessary. Thompson's behavior should have been addressed years ago. The fact that it wasn't is a failure of leadership, including me." He paused. "Over the next 2 weeks, we'll be reviewing the structure of this department. We need to understand what you need to do your jobs well without sacrificing your well-being or safety. We'll be interviewing team leads, looking at workflow, and most importantly, listening to your feedback about what needs to change." Sarah Chun raised her hand. "Who's managing the department now?" "Temporarily, Martha Chun from operations will oversee logistics," Caleb said. "But we're promoting from within for permanent leadership. If you're interested in management and can demonstrate both competence and character, we want to hear from you. The application process will be transparent and fair." The week continued with mathematical precision. Tuesday, Angela Morrison from Client Services. 15 complaints. Pattern of playing favorites, creating cliques, and freezing out employees who didn't fit her preferred profile. She argued. She threatened lawsuits. She claimed discrimination. But the documentation was airtight: dates, witnesses, policy violations. Her termination stood. Wednesday, Kyle Brennan from Marketing. Young, charismatic, great with clients. Terrible with subordinates. 11 complaints, mostly from women on his team about inappropriate comments disguised as jokes, taking credit for their creative work, and retaliating against anyone who pushed back. He tried charm. Tried apologizing. Tried promising to change. Too late. Thursday, Eduardo Salazar from Finance. The saddest case, in Caleb's opinion. Eduardo had been a good manager once. Employees from his early years spoke highly of him. But something had shifted: stress, personal issues, burnout. He'd become harsh, unapproachable, quick to blame his team for his own mistakes. 10 complaints over 2 years. Unlike the others, Eduardo didn't argue. He signed the papers quietly, apologized to Patricia, and walked out with dignity. Caleb made a mental note. They needed better support systems for managers showing signs of burnout before they became part of the problem. Friday, Dennis Coe from Product Development. 8 complaints, all serious. Stealing intellectual property from his team members and patenting ideas under his own name. Creating a competitive rather than collaborative environment. Sabotaging projects of employees he perceived as threats. Dennis threatened legal action. Claimed his employment contract protected him. James Bradford calmly pulled out the morality clause in Dennis's contract that specifically allowed termination for intellectual property theft and fraud. Dennis left threatening to contact the media. Caleb almost hoped he would. Let the story get out about what happened to managers who stole from their own teams. By Friday evening, Caleb sat alone in what was technically now his office. He hadn't moved into it officially, still felt weird to occupy the space his father had built, but he needed somewhere private to decompress. 5 managers terminated in 5 days. Hundreds of employees affected. Decades of combined experience removed from the company. The right decisions. He knew that, but right decisions could still feel heavy. His phone buzzed. A text from his father. "How are you holding up?" Caleb typed back. "Is it supposed to feel this awful? Even when you know you're doing the right thing?" Richard's response came quickly. "Yes. If it didn't, you'd be like them, making decisions about people's lives without feeling the weight of it. The fact that it's hard means you're doing it right. That's leadership, son. It's supposed to cost you something." Caleb stared at those words. "It's supposed to cost you something." Another text came through, this one from Jennifer. "A bunch of us are grabbing drinks after work. You should come. You look like you need to remember that humans exist outside of termination meetings." He smiled despite the exhaustion. "Can the boss grab drinks with employees? Isn't that weird? You literally spent 2 years being one of us. Don't get weird on me now, Rivers. Same bar, same booth, 1 hour. Be there." Caleb looked at the city outside his window. Chicago at sunset, millions of people living their lives, most of them dealing with some version of these same struggles. Bad bosses. Unfair systems. The hope that maybe things could be better. He'd fired 5 managers this week. Disrupted dozens of departments. Started processes that would take months to fully implement. But somewhere out there, employees who'd been suffering were breathing easier. People who'd been scared to come to work might actually look forward to it now. That had to count for something. His phone buzzed again. A company-wide email notification. From Patricia. "Employee feedback survey now live. Your voice matters." The survey they'd promised. Anonymous. Comprehensive. Asking real questions about management experience, workplace culture, and what needed to change. Within 10 minutes, 200 responses had come in. By the time Caleb left his office an hour later, over 800 employees had submitted feedback. People were ready to talk, ready to be heard, ready to believe that maybe this time their voices actually mattered. Caleb headed to the bar where Jennifer was waiting. He needed one night to remember that he wasn't just the owner or the boss. He was also just Caleb, a 26-year-old trying to fix a broken company and hoping he wasn't screwing it up too badly. The transformation was happening, but it was messier, harder, and more emotionally exhausting than he'd imagined. And they were only 2 weeks in. "We have a problem," Patricia said, sliding her tablet across the conference table to Caleb. It was Monday morning, 3 weeks after the 5 management terminations. 3 weeks of new policies, employee surveys, and promised transformation. The survey data Patricia showed him wasn't what he'd hoped to see. Overall satisfaction with management, up 18%. Good. Feeling of psychological safety, up 22%. Better. But there was another metric. One he hadn't expected. Employee concern about excessive political correctness and inability to give honest feedback without fear of termination, up 33%. "What am I looking at?" Caleb asked. Gregory leaned forward. "Backlash. We're seeing it across middle management and some senior staff. They feel like they can't say anything critical or push employees to perform without being accused of creating hostile work environment." Martha added, "I've had 3 department heads come to me saying their teams are underperforming because everyone's afraid to give negative feedback. They think any criticism will be reported as toxic behavior." Jennifer, newly promoted to a role Caleb had created specifically to bridge the gap between leadership and employees, spoke carefully. "I've been hearing it from the employee side too. Some people are confused about where the line is. Like, can my manager tell me my work isn't good enough? Or is that hostile?" Caleb absorbed this. He'd been so focused on eliminating toxic behavior that he hadn't clearly communicated the difference between tough management and abusive management. The pendulum had swung too far, too fast. Meanwhile, in a different conference room, 8 middle managers were having their own meeting. Unofficially, Brian Foster, a department head in product development, stood at the whiteboard. "Look, I'm all for treating people with respect. But we can't run a company where nobody can be criticized, where every performance issue becomes an HR incident, and where managers are terrified to make tough calls. Heads nodded around the table. These weren't the toxic managers who'd been terminated. These were decent people who'd been trying to do their jobs well. But now they felt like they were walking through a minefield. I had to give negative feedback to an employee last week, said Karen Liu from finance. Standard stuff, missed deadlines, quality issues. The next day, I got a call from HR asking if I'd considered the employee's emotional well-being during the conversation. Since when is honest feedback an HR concern? It's the overcorrection, Brian said. They fired 5 managers in 1 week, and now everyone's terrified of being next. So we're all walking on eggshells, avoiding difficult conversations, letting problems slide, because we don't want to be accused of toxicity. A younger manager, Marcus from IT, spoke up. But didn't those managers deserve to be fired? Thompson had 17 complaints. Mark Halden was publicly humiliating people. That's not the same as giving someone constructive criticism. Of course they deserved it, Brian agreed. But where's the line? That's what nobody's explaining. We got a 3-hour training on respectful management practices that basically told us everything we shouldn't do. But it didn't tell us what we should do when an employee isn't meeting expectations. Karen pulled up an email on her phone. Look at this. New policy. All performance conversations must be documented and shared with HR within 24 hours. Do you know how much time that adds to my day? I manage 12 people. If I'm documenting every conversation, I'll spend half my day on paperwork instead of actually managing. The frustration in the room was palpable. These managers weren't resisting change because they wanted to protect toxic behavior. They were resisting because the change felt unclear, burdensome, and like it didn't trust them to be decent human beings. Caleb decided to do what had worked before. Walk the floor and listen. But the response was different than 3 weeks ago. Some employees still greeted him warmly. Sarah Chun from logistics stopped him to thank him again for removing Thompson. David Cortez gave him his usual friendly nod. But others seemed nervous around him now. Conversations would pause when he approached, then resume carefully after he passed. A group of employees from marketing literally stopped talking mid-sentence when he walked by their area. He wasn't naive. He knew what they were probably discussing, the same concerns the managers had. Am I going to get my manager fired if I complain? Can my manager still push me to improve my work? Where's the line between tough and toxic? Near the break room, he overheard a snippet of conversation. Just seems like we went from one extreme to another. Before, toxic managers could do whatever they wanted. Now it feels like no manager can do anything. The speaker noticed Caleb and immediately stopped talking, face flushing with embarrassment. Don't stop on my account, Caleb said gently. What you're saying is important. Can we talk? The employee, a guy named Marcus from client services, looked terrified. I wasn't criticizing you, sir. I think what you did with Mark and Thompson was right. Marcus, Caleb interrupted. You're allowed to have concerns. You're allowed to think we overcorrected. That's exactly the feedback I need to hear. Can we grab coffee? 5 minutes later, they sat in the break room with terrible coffee from the machine nobody could figure out how to clean properly. Tell me what you're worried about, Caleb said. Marcus took a breath. My manager, Lisa, she's great. Really supportive, fair, helps us grow. But lately she seems scared to give us critical feedback. Like last week, I submitted a client proposal that honestly wasn't my best work. I was rushed, cut corners. Lisa approved it with minor notes. Old Lisa would have sent it back and told me to do better. But now, she's afraid that pushing back will be seen as hostile, Caleb finished. Marcus nodded. And the thing is, I needed her to push back. I needed someone to say, this isn't good enough, you can do better. That's not toxic. That's management. That conversation with Marcus changed Caleb's approach. The next day, he called an emergency meeting with his transformation team. We need to clarify the standards, Caleb said. Right now, managers are afraid to manage and employees aren't sure what's acceptable to report. We've created confusion where we meant to create clarity. Agreed, Patricia said. The training we rolled out was too focused on what not to do. We need to show what good management looks like. Jennifer pulled up her notes. I've been compiling feedback. Employees want to know. Can my manager tell me my work isn't good enough? Can they set challenging deadlines? Can they have difficult conversations about performance? Most people aren't looking for coddling. They're looking for fair treatment. Gregory added the financial perspective. We're also seeing productivity dips in 3 departments where managers have essentially stopped giving critical feedback. That's not sustainable. Over the next week, they redesigned the management training. Instead of a 3-hour lecture about violations and consequences, they created scenario-based workshops. Real situations. What's the right way to handle this? Scenario. An employee consistently misses deadlines. Toxic response. Publicly calling them out, threatening their job, questioning their intelligence. Professional response. Private conversation, understanding root causes, setting clear expectations and support systems, documenting the conversation. Scenario. An employee submits poor quality work. Toxic response. Telling them they're incompetent, comparing them to other employees, taking the work and doing it yourself while. Complaining. Professional response. Specific feedback on what's wrong and how to improve, offering resources or training if needed, setting a timeline for improvement. The scenarios were developed from real complaints in the files. Managers could see clearly where the line was. And more importantly, they could see that honest, tough, clear management wasn't toxic. It was necessary. Friday afternoon, Caleb called another company gathering. Not as formal as the town hall. This was in the cafeteria, and people could come and go as needed. But he needed to address the confusion directly. "I owe you all an apology," he began, standing on a chair so everyone could see him. That got people's attention. The owner apologizing? 3 weeks ago, we made dramatic changes to address toxic management. Those changes were necessary. But I didn't communicate clearly enough about what we were actually trying to fix. And that's created confusion and anxiety. So let me be crystal clear right now. He pulled out a simple chart he'd printed. There's a huge difference between tough management and toxic management. Tough management sets high standards, gives honest feedback, holds people accountable, and supports people in meeting expectations. That's not only okay, it's necessary. We need that. I want that. The room was silent, listening. Toxic management tears people down personally, creates fear instead of accountability, retaliates against people who speak up, and treats humans as disposable. That's what we're eliminating. Not high standards. Not honest feedback. Not accountability. Just cruelty and abuse of power. He put down the chart. If your manager tells you your work isn't good enough and explains specifically how to improve it, that's not toxic. If your manager sets challenging deadlines and expects you to meet them, that's not toxic. If your manager has difficult conversations about performance issues, that's not toxic. But, he continued, if your manager screams at you, belittles you personally, takes credit for your work, retaliates when you disagree, or makes you feel afraid to come to work, that's toxic. And we won't tolerate it. A hand went up. One of the IT managers. So if I need to give negative feedback to an employee, I'm not going to get in trouble as long as I do it respectfully? Correct, Caleb confirmed. In fact, if you're not giving honest feedback, you're not doing your job. We need managers who can have hard conversations. We just need them to do it with respect and professionalism. Another question from the floor. What about the documentation requirement? It feels like micromanagement. Patricia fielded this one. We're revising that policy. You only need to document formal performance improvement plans and disciplinary actions. Regular coaching conversations don't need HR paperwork. We overcorrected on that one, and we're fixing it. The questions continued for an hour. Real concerns, honest confusion, genuine desire to understand the new norms. And Caleb answered every one, admitting mistakes where they'd been made, clarifying where confusion existed. By the time it ended, the atmosphere had shifted. The fear and uncertainty were being replaced by understanding. People were nodding. Managers looked relieved. Employees looked reassured. Change was still happening. But now it was clearer, more nuanced, more sustainable. 6 months. That's how long it took to know if organizational change was real or just temporary theater. Caleb stood at his office window on a Monday morning in March, watching employees arrive for work. The difference from 6 months ago was visible even from 30 floors up. People walked into the building talking to each other. Laughing, even. Nobody was rushing in with that particular body language of dread that he'd observed during his undercover months. His phone showed the latest metrics. Gregory had sent them over at 6 a.m. The CFO apparently never slept. Employee retention, up 42% compared to this time last year. Voluntary turnover, down from 32% to 18%. Cost savings from reduced recruitment and training, $2.3 million annually. Productivity metrics, up 11% across departments with new management. Client satisfaction scores, highest in company history. The numbers told one story. But Caleb had learned that numbers could lie if you didn't understand the human reality behind them. So he'd kept walking the floors, kept eating lunch in the cafeteria, kept his door open for anyone who wanted to talk. And what he'd discovered was that real change was messier, slower, and more complicated than he'd imagined. But it was also real. Patricia's leadership development program had become the backbone of the cultural transformation. Every new manager, and there had been 12 promoted from within over the past 6 months, went through an intensive 3-month training before taking on direct reports. "How's the new cohort doing?" Caleb asked, joining Patricia's weekly mentorship session. The 3 newest managers looked up: Keisha Williams from Operations, James Park from IT, and Carlos Mendez from Client Services. All 3 had been individual contributors 6 months ago. All 3 had been promoted based on demonstrated competence and character. "They're doing great," Patricia said with genuine pride. "But let's hear from them. Keisha, tell Caleb about the situation you handled last week." Keisha, who'd been one of Thompson's former employees in logistics, took a breath. "One of my team members, Derek, has been missing deadlines consistently. Old me would have just complained about it or avoided the conversation. But we learned in training that avoiding hard conversations is actually worse for everyone." "So what did you do?" Caleb asked. "I had a private conversation with him. Asked if everything was okay. Turns out his mother was diagnosed with cancer, and he's been trying to handle it all without telling anyone. We worked out a modified schedule for the next month, connected him with the Employee Assistance Program, and redistributed some of his workload temporarily." "That's excellent management," Caleb said. "How did Derek respond?" "He actually thanked me," Keisha said, sounding surprised. "He thought he was going to get fired. Instead, he got support. And now that he's not drowning, his work quality is back up." James Park shared his story next. "I had to put someone on a performance improvement plan. First time I've ever had to do formal discipline. I was terrified of doing it wrong." "Walk us through it," Patricia encouraged. "I documented specific issues, missed code reviews, bugs making it to production, not following team protocols. I met with him privately, explained exactly what needed to improve, gave him resources and weekly check-ins for support, and made it clear that I believed he could succeed, but these specific things needed to change. And he's responding well. 2 weeks in, and I'm already seeing improvement. But the key was being specific and supportive, not just threatening. The training really helped with that." The cafeteria at lunch had become Caleb's favorite place to gauge company culture. You couldn't fake cafeteria dynamics. People either felt comfortable or they didn't. 6 months ago, people ate quickly and left or ate at their desks. Departments didn't mix. Senior employees didn't socialize with junior staff. Now, the cafeteria actually felt like a community space. Jennifer Kim waved Caleb over to a table where she sat with people from 3 different departments. "Caleb, settle an argument. Is the new project management system actually better, or are we just pretending it is because you implemented it?" He laughed and sat down. "I want honest feedback, not politeness. What's the problem with it?" A developer from IT jumped in. "It's got too many notification options. I'm getting pinged constantly and can't figure out how to adjust settings without turning off important alerts." "That's fair," Caleb said, pulling out his phone and making a note. "I'll have IT create a simplified settings guide and maybe reduce default notifications." "What else?" They talked for 20 minutes. Not formal feedback, just conversation. But Caleb learned more from these cafeteria sessions than from any survey. He learned that the new expense reporting system was clunky, that the client services team needed better software. Integration. That people wanted more cross-departmental projects because they were tired of working in silos. He learned that people felt comfortable disagreeing with him, comfortable offering criticism, comfortable treating him like a person instead of an untouchable authority figure. That was culture change you couldn't manufacture. Martha Chun had invited Caleb to observe a team meeting in operations. 6 months ago, these meetings had been one-way communications. Managers talked, employees nodded. Everyone left as quickly as possible. Now, Martha's team sat in a circle rather than rows. The manager, Lisa Rodriguez, promoted from within 3 months ago, was facilitating, not lecturing. "Okay, the Chicago distribution center is consistently running behind on Thursday shipments," Lisa said, pulling up data. "I don't have the answer. You all work this daily. What's the problem?" Hands went up. People talked over each other with ideas. Thursday is when we get the bulk shipment from the West Coast supplier. And we're trying to process incoming and outgoing simultaneously. What if we shifted the processing schedule to, or stagger the supplier delivery to Wednesday night? Lisa wrote everything on the whiteboard. Not her ideas. Their ideas. She was facilitating problem solving, not dictating solutions. After 15 minutes of discussion, the team had developed 3 possible solutions. Lisa assigned owners to test each one and report back next week. That's what I'm talking about, Caleb said quietly to Martha, watching from the back of the room. 6 months ago, Lisa would have been told what to do by her manager. She would have told her team what to do. Nobody would have asked the people actually doing the work what they thought. Now look at them. It's not perfect everywhere, Martha cautioned. Some departments are adapting faster than others. And we still have a few managers struggling with the new approach. Show me, Caleb said. Once a month, Caleb held open feedback sessions. 20 employees, randomly selected from across the company, invited to talk directly with leadership about what was working and what wasn't. No agenda, no PowerPoint, just conversation. Tonight's group was diverse. New hires, veterans, various departments, different levels. Caleb sat among them, not at the head of the circle. Ground rules, he began. Everything said here is confidential unless you specifically want it acted on. I'm here to listen, not defend. Honest feedback, even harsh feedback, is welcomed. Who wants to start? An older woman from accounting, Doris, raised her hand. I've been at Northline for 19 years. I've seen a lot of initiatives come and go. Usually they're announced with fanfare, everyone gets excited, and then 6 months later we're back to the old way of doing things. I'm cautiously optimistic about these changes, but I'm also waiting for the other shoe to drop. Honest. Fair. Exactly what Caleb needed to hear. What would convince you this is different? He asked. Sustained consistency, Doris said immediately. If we're still doing these feedback sessions in a year, if the new managers are still getting real support and training, if problems that get identified actually get fixed, that's what would convince me. A younger guy from IT spoke up. I'm newer here, only 8 months, so I didn't experience the before times everyone talks about. But I can tell you that compared to my last 2 companies, this place actually feels like leadership cares. My manager has one-on-ones with me every week. When I raised concerns about workload, they actually adjusted project timelines instead of just telling me to work harder. That's new for me. A woman from client services. I love the changes, but I'm worried about sustainability. Caleb, you're in the weeds with us now. But what happens when you step back? Will the next level of leadership maintain this culture? Excellent question. That's exactly why we're investing so heavily in leadership development, Caleb answered. The goal isn't for me to personally manage culture forever. It's to build systems and develop leaders who will maintain these standards long after I'm less involved in daily operations. But you're right to be concerned. We need to institutionalize this, not make it dependent on one person. The feedback continued for 2 hours. Some praise, some concerns, some specific problems that needed fixing. Caleb took notes on everything. When it ended, several people came up to him individually. Thank you for actually listening, one person said. Most executives just defend themselves when they hear criticism. That comment stuck with Caleb as he drove home that night. The transformation wasn't just about firing toxic managers or implementing new policies. It was about changing the fundamental relationship between leadership and employees. From authoritarian to collaborative. From defensive to open. From profit at any cost to sustainable success through human investment. His phone buzzed. A text from his father. Dinner tomorrow? Want to hear how it's going? Caleb smiled. 6 months ago, Richard had been ready to storm the building and destroy Mark Halden personally. Now he was stepping back, letting Caleb lead, checking in but not interfering. That was growth too. Sure. But I'm buying. I own a company now, remember? Richard's response. The company owns you, son. Don't forget the difference. See you at 7. Caleb looked out at Chicago's lights. Somewhere in this city, Mark Halden was probably cursing him. Thompson too. Maybe the other terminated managers as well. But somewhere in this city, Keisha Williams was going home confident in her management abilities. Derek was handling his mother's cancer with workplace support instead of fear. Lisa Rodriguez was leading a team that actually contributed ideas. And thousands of Northline employees were working for a company that valued them as humans, not just resources. That was the proof. Not just in the metrics, though those mattered. The proof was in the lived experience of people who showed up to work and felt respected, heard, and valued. The transformation wasn't finished. Maybe it never would be. Culture was continuous work, not a destination. But it was real. And it was holding. 1 year. 12 months since the day Mark Halden fired the owner of the company without knowing it. 52 weeks since everything changed. Northline Solutions had rented out a park near the office building for the anniversary celebration. Not a corporate event with speeches and PowerPoints. An actual party. Employees brought families. There were food trucks, live music, and games for kids. This was a thank you, not a performance. Caleb stood with his father near the edge of the celebration, watching people laugh and relax. You did it, Richard said quietly. You actually did it. We did it, Caleb corrected. I couldn't have done this alone. Patricia, Gregory, Martha, Jennifer, the employees who trusted the process even when it was messy. Everyone contributed. Richard nodded. But you led it. There's a difference between announcing change and actually doing the hard work of transformation. You did the hard work. Across the park, Keisha Williams was playing catch with her kids. Carlos Mendez was manning the grill, wearing an apron that said "Best Boss Ever" that his team had given him. Jennifer Kim was organizing a cornhole tournament with way too much competitive energy. These were the people who'd made the transformation real. Not the dramatic firings. Not the policies. The people who'd stepped up, taken risks, trusted that things could be better, and then worked to make them better. Want to make a speech? Richard asked. Everyone expects the boss to say something. Do they? Caleb looked around. Nobody was watching him expectantly. Nobody was waiting for a speech. They were just enjoying themselves. I think the speech would ruin it, he said. Let them have fun without performing for leadership. Monday morning, the operations floor looked different than it had a year ago. Not just in decoration, though there was more natural light, more collaborative spaces, more personality allowed in the environment. It looked different in the way people moved through it. Nobody was hiding in their cubicles. Conversations happened openly. Laughter was audible. People actually seemed to want to be there. Caleb walked through during his regular morning rounds. This had become routine, not micromanagement, just presence. Being accessible. A new employee, Marcus Chun, stopped him nervously. Mr. Rivers, sorry to interrupt, but I have an idea about the client onboarding process. It's probably stupid, but... Stop, Caleb interrupted gently. First, call me Caleb. Second, there are no stupid ideas, only ideas we haven't tested yet. Third, I literally have 30 minutes free right now. Want to walk me through it? They spent 25 minutes at a whiteboard while Marcus explained his idea. A streamlined onboarding checklist that would reduce time to first value for new clients by an estimated 40%. It was brilliant. Simple, elegant, actionable. Marcus, this is exactly the kind of thinking we need, Caleb said. Write up a one-page proposal. I'll get you time with the client services leadership this week. If it tests well, we'll implement it company-wide and you'll get full credit. Marcus looked stunned. Really? Just like that? Just like that. Good ideas should move fast, regardless of who has them. That's how we innovate. After Marcus left, practically floating, Jennifer appeared beside Caleb. You know that kid's going to tell that story for years, right? The day the CEO spent half an hour listening to his idea. Good, Caleb said. That's the culture we're building. Ideas matter more than hierarchy. The quarterly strategy meeting looked different than a year ago. The executive table had expanded. Patricia, Gregory, and Martha were still there, core leadership. But now the table included Keisha Williams, Carlos Mendez, Lisa Rodriguez, and 3 other managers who'd been promoted from within. Voices that hadn't been in strategic conversations before. Let's talk about expansion, Caleb began. We've been approached about acquiring a smaller logistics company in Minneapolis. Good infrastructure, struggling with management and culture issues. Sound familiar? Knowing smiles around the table. Due diligence shows their operational metrics are mediocre, but their client base is solid, Gregory reported. The asking price is fair if we can turn around the performance. But can we? Martha asked. We barely finished transforming our own culture. Can we do it again somewhere else? Keisha leaned forward. Actually, I think we can. We've developed a playbook. We know what toxic management looks like. We know how to identify it, address it, and replace it with effective leadership. The Minneapolis acquisition could prove that our model is scalable. Carlos added, And think about what that means for the employees there. If they're dealing with what we were dealing with a year ago, imagine the relief when they realize they're being acquired by a company that actually values people. The discussion continued for hours. Not just about the acquisition, but about Northline's larger vision. Could they become known not just for logistics, but for corporate culture? Could they prove that treating people well was actually more profitable than treating them as disposable? By the end of the meeting, the decision was made: acquire the Minneapolis company, but only after conducting cultural due diligence. They'd interview employees, review HR files, understand exactly what they were dealing with. Then they'd implement the transformation playbook they'd developed. We're not just buying a company, Caleb said. We're extending our culture to more people who need it. If we're going to grow, that's how we grow. The documentary crew had been following Northline for 3 months. A filmmaker doing a project about innovative corporate leadership had reached out, and after initial hesitation, Caleb had agreed. Not for ego, for impact. If their story could inspire other companies to examine their cultures, then the transparency was worth it. So looking back, the interviewer asked, do you wish you'd revealed who you were sooner? Stopped Mark Halden before he had the chance to fire you. Caleb thought about that. No, because if I'd revealed myself earlier, Mark would have apologized and adjusted his behavior around me, but he would have continued being toxic to everyone else. The system would have stayed broken. By letting it play out, we exposed the structural problems, not just one bad manager. Some critics say your approach was manipulative, the interviewer continued, that you essentially set Mark up to fail. Mark set himself up to fail, Caleb corrected firmly. He had 17 complaints over 4 years. He had opportunities to change. The company had opportunities to address it. Nobody was manipulated into toxic behavior. We just finally stopped ignoring it. What would you say to other business leaders watching this who recognize similar problems in their own organizations? Caleb looked directly at the camera. That change is possible, but it requires courage. It's easier to ignore toxic managers who hit their numbers. It's easier to avoid hard conversations about culture. But the cost of that avoidance is enormous, in money, in talent, in human suffering. And once you truly understand that cost, you can't unsee it. You have to act. And for employees dealing with toxic management, document everything. Build allies. Use whatever reporting systems exist. And know that you deserve better. If your company won't change, find one that will. Life's too short to spend 40 hours a week being miserable because someone in power enjoys making you suffer. The office was quiet at 6 p.m. on a Friday. Most people had gone home, something that was now normal instead of rare. Work-life balance had become actual policy, not just corporate speak. Caleb stood at his window, holding the leather notebook that had documented his entire undercover experience. He'd started a new one for his time as revealed owner, but he kept the original nearby. A reminder of where they'd come from. He flipped through the pages. Notes about Mark's public humiliation tactics. Documentation of Thompson's safety violations. Observations about which managers inspired loyalty and which ruled through fear. All the evidence he'd needed to justify the transformation. His phone buzzed. A LinkedIn notification. Mark Halden had posted something. Caleb almost didn't look, but curiosity got the better of him. 1 year ago, I learned the hardest lesson of my career. That results don't excuse behavior. I was terminated from a company I thought I understood, and I spent months angry, defensive, and blaming everyone but myself. But therapy, reflection, and honest self-assessment have shown me that I was the problem. I built my management style on fear and control, took credit for others' work, and treated people as obstacles rather than assets. I'm now working as a consultant helping companies identify and address toxic management culture by recognizing the patterns I used to embody. If you're a manager reading this, your numbers might be good, but are your people? Because I learned the hard way that destroying people to hit targets isn't leadership. It's just destruction. Caleb read it twice. He didn't know if Mark's change was genuine or performative, but at least he was acknowledging the problem. At least the story was out there, making other managers think twice about their behavior. His father appeared in the doorway. Heading home. Yeah, Caleb said, closing the notebook. Just reflecting. On how one moment, getting fired by someone who didn't know he was firing his boss, changed everything. For the company. For me. For everyone involved. Richard walked to the window beside his son. You know what I'm proudest of? That the company's profitable? Caleb guessed. No, that you built something sustainable. These changes aren't dependent on you micromanaging everything. You created systems, developed leaders, and established a culture that will outlast any individual. That's legacy. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city lights grow brighter as the sun set. So what's next? Richard asked. Minneapolis acquisition. Probably more after that. Every company we can help transform is worth the effort. And personally, Caleb smiled. Maybe I'll finally take a vacation. Apparently, that's allowed now. They walked out together, turning off the lights. The building would be empty until Monday. Employees would spend the weekend with families, pursuing hobbies, living lives that weren't consumed by workplace dread. That was the real measure of success. Not just business metrics, but human flourishing. As Caleb drove home through Chicago traffic, he thought about the past year. The dramatic firings, the policy changes, the resistance and adjustment, the slow, hard work of cultural transformation. It hadn't been clean or easy. There had been setbacks, mistakes, overcorrections, and resistance. But it had been real. And it had worked. Mark Halden had fired him thinking he was eliminating a problem employee. Instead, he'd triggered a transformation that reshaped an entire company. Thousands of people now worked in an environment that valued their humanity, not just their productivity. That was worth getting fired for. That was worth everything that came after. Caleb pulled into his building's parking garage and grabbed his leather notebook from the passenger seat. He'd start a new entry tonight. Not about problems to fix or people to monitor. Just observations about what it felt like to lead a company that finally aligned with his values. The manager fired him without knowing he owned the company. His dad had freaked out when he heard it. And together, they'd built something better than either of them could have created alone. The story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. Because culture change wasn't a destination. It was a commitment. And Caleb Rivers was committed for the long haul. If this story inspired you, drop a comment telling me what one thing you'd change about your workplace culture if you had the power. Hit that subscribe button because stories like this, about real leadership, honest change, and human dignity, are what we need more of in the world. And smash that like button if you believe companies can be both profitable and humane. Your engagement helps this message reach more people who need to hear it. Now go make your workplace better, one conversation at a time. You have more power than you think.